Greetings, friends of liberty. I must confess to counting the Yuletide season, as it is here celebrated, as amongst our most joyful occasions. But given that there are such a multitude of English customs and traditions to embrace, one hardly knows where to begin. One might, for example, if the Thames is frozen, as it last was in 1789, venture out on the ice to purchase the novelty of a postcard printed there. Or purchase sausages with onions on toasted bread, or some delectable spiced toddy, piping hot, being careful to retain enough of one's balance to make the stairs at Westminster. Secondly, one might be granted a peerage of sorts, as a temporary lord of misrule, and play pranks on one's neighbours, such as unsnapping the back of the dress of a lady whose nose is tilted a bit too high, or introducing a greased pig into someone's home. But amongst the most pleasant, it must be admitted, is the tradition of kissing under the mistletoe. Just 3 days ago, for example, Margaret and I visited the home of our friend barrister John Courtney at his London residence. Before dinner, as the children of various guests were running about, an inventive boy put a sprig of mistletoe on a headband, it overreaching his face by 8 inches or so. And then he walked to John's daughter Dorothy, and she being under it, demanded a kiss. But she, like her father, the barrister, argued instead that a mobile mistletoe headband was disallowed by custom, there being hardly any precedent. The boy disagreed, and they, coming to no resolution, appealed to me, so to speak, as the appellate court. My judgment was that Dorothy was indeed correct, and Dorothy, happy to have won, ran off. Whereupon the boy removed the mistletoe and put it simply over the entrance to the hallway, and then, when Dorothy unknowingly ran under it, again claimed his claimed his kiss. She, surveying the mistletoe, agreed, but grabbed his hand, intending to kiss him on the finger. He drew his hand back and claimed that kissing meant kissing on the lips. She replied that a kiss, however, could be placed anywhere. Whereupon, again coming to no resolution, they brought their suit to the appellate judge, and I again ruled that a kiss must be placed on skin, but that any skin would do. Whereupon Dorothy snatched his hand, and he, withdrawing it, she reached around to kiss him on the earlobe, and then ran off, laughing. I later congratulated John, saying that we can see that this apple didn't fall very far from the tree. Now, if we turn to the general issue of peace on earth and goodwill towards men, in late antiquity, in Europe, we find that the Christians banned the use of mistletoe, precisely because of its association with kissing. What killjoys! This early Christian hostility towards kissing and much else besides is chronicled in Catherine Nixey's The Darkening Age, the Christian destruction of the classical world. For anyone unacquainted with the violence and vandalism that on a cultural level equaled that wrought on the physical by the Vandals in their sack of Rome in 455 AD, this book lays bare the brutal historical reality documenting the thoroughgoing Christian hostility towards joy, health, sex, and human knowledge. Miss Nixey begins her narrative by describing how packs of monks, black-robed and living in the desert, would emerge by the hundreds and descend upon pagan temples and statues, making quick work of their annihilation. Armed with little more than stones, iron bars, and an iron sense of righteousness, great stone columns that had stood for centuries collapsed in an afternoon. Statues that had stood for half a millennium had their faces mutilated in a moment. Temples that had seen the rise of the Roman Empire fell in a single day. The zealots roared with laughter as they smashed the evil idolatrous statues. The faithful jeered as they tore down temples, stripped roofs, and defaced tombs. This was the face of Christianity towards those who disagreed, and at least in part the method of its triumph. No peace on earth nor goodwill towards men here. Let's examine some of the more notable events and tendencies that characterize this whole destructive process. Number one, was the adoption of Christianity to occur voluntarily? As time went on, increasingly not. In one city, it was announced that anyone who had not yet been baptized was to come forward and make themselves known at the holy churches immediately or face exile. And the penalty for backsliding? Execution. Number two, how did Christians justify their coercion? They were helping people. In other words, if we assume a non-believer has an immortal soul, then really you're justified in doing anything to save that soul, sparing him thus an eternity of hellfire. As St. Augustine put it, the church persecutes in the spirit of love, that she may correct. Number three, most admired by Christians were the ascetics who gave up everything, such as St. Anthony of the Desert, who in Egypt in 270 walked out of his house, sold his possessions, and gave all his land away and went to live in a pigsty. These were the Christian heroes. Antony wore a hair shirt and never washed. He only cleaned the mud from his feet when he happened to cross a stream. No wonder so many other cultures, from the Aztecs to the Japanese, rightly thought Christians filthy. And poor Antony was constantly tempted by Satan, who sent him visions of naked women. At least by claiming that these were visions, Antony could deny the authenticity of these feelings. Number four, this constant evocation of devils in the minds of ignorant, filthy monks was easily projected onto naked classical statues in their temples. This in part explains the orgy of Christian destruction. Jupiter, Aphrodite, Bacchus, and Isis, all of them in the eyes of Christian writers, were demonic. In addition, they apparently believed that the sacrifices that the pagans made to these gods of animals and other foods were what allowed the demons to continue existing by feeding on the offerings. Thus, the monks thought it would be easy to destroy the demons by just stopping the sacrifices. Number five, how did some of the more prominent Greek and Roman intellectuals respond to the marked proliferation of inane Christian superstitions and theology? One of the greatest doctors and researchers of the classical era was the Roman Galen, who lived from 129 to 216 AD. How did he, whose understanding of neuroanatomy would not be superseded until the 17th century and of functions of the brain until the 19th, regard the Christians who rejected empirical testing and evidence as dunces? Similarly, he regarded the Moses of the Old Testament as writing without offering proofs. Galen understood here that there could be no greater scientific sin. Another notable classical critic of Christianity was the Greek philosopher Celsus, living in Rome in the 2nd century. He believed a Roman soldier had got Mary pregnant, that the creation is absurd, the books of Moses garbage, while the idea of the resurrection of the body is revolting and, on a practical level, ridiculous. In addition, he wondered why there was such a great gap between the creation of mankind and the sending of Jesus. If all who don't believe are damned, why wait so long to enable them to be saved? But, as Nixey points out, even today almost no one has heard of Celsus, and fewer still have read his work. Why is that? Number 6, because the transcription efforts of the armies of monks that made up the monasteries of Christendom was at times very selective. What happened to most of those ancient texts? Simply erased with pumice, scrubbed away so that their pages could be reused for more elevated themes. Other ancient texts were lost through ignorance. Despised and ignored over the years, they simply crumbled into dust, food for bookworms. The work of Democritus, one of the greatest Greek philosophers and the father of atomic theory, was entirely lost. Only 1% of Latin literature survived the centuries. Similarly, all of Celsus's writings simply disappeared. Not one single unadulterated volume of the work by Christianity's first great critic has survived. The same method was used against Porphyry, who wrote a 15-volume critique of Christianity, only fragments of which remain. A particularly poignant example of disappearance was the following. In a 10th century copy of a work by Archimedes called The Method of Mechanical Theorems, Archimedes had ingeniously applied mechanical laws, such as the law of the lever, to find the volume and area of geometric shapes. 2,000 years before Newton, he had come tantalizingly close to deriving calculus. However, in the 13th century, this work was scraped off and overwritten with a prayer book. In sum, from the entirety of the 6th century on, only scraps of 2 manuscripts by the satirical Roman poet Juvenal survive, and mere remnants of 2 others, one by the elder and one by the younger Pliny. From the next century, there survives nothing save a single fragment of the poet Lucan. From the start of the next century, nothing at all. Number 7. How often were the Christians themselves attacked by the Roman state? There were 3 main phases of persecution. The Decian, the Valerian 7 years later, and the Great Persecution 50-odd years later after that in 303. The main sticking point was the Christians' refusal to sacrifice to or give prayers to the emperor. Estimates are that around 5,000 to 7,000 Christians were killed in all. But our historian emphasizes, in many cases, aside from the famous case of Nero, the great reluctance of Roman governors and officials to make Christian martyrs. Number 8. The greatest library of antiquity at Alexandria, with, depending on estimates, between 500,000 and 700,000 volumes, had been largely destroyed by an earlier fire. But the Christians finished what was left of it, and it was over a millennium before any other library would even come close to its holdings. Number 9. The homosexuality that the classical world had tolerated or even celebrated, outlawed. And by the time of the Middle Ages, with death in many instances as the punishment if caught. And the very varied sexual practices that were portrayed unabashedly in the Roman world, as typified by the statues and frescoes uncovered at Pompeii, roundly condemned. This Christian distaste coming all the way into the 19th and 20th centuries. Number 10. Not only did the state, after the accession of Constantine in 312, increasingly use violence to make people conform to the dictates of Christianity, but it also used positive sanctions, such as bribery, tax exemptions for the church, or state privileges such as appointment to office. Clerics were exempted from public duties, bishops were lavished with gifts and banquets, annual allowances were given to the widows, virgins, and nuns. The expensive list went on. And how was all this financed by the Emperor Constantine? The great Roman and Greek temples were broken open and their statues brought out, then mutilated. Officials scraped off the material which seemed to be usable, purifying it by smelting with fire, then poured the precious metal into the public purse. The valueless remains were left for the superstitious to keep as a souvenir of their shame. As Constantine's nephew, the Emperor Julian, would scornfully say, Constantine was a tyrant with the mind of a banker. His destruction emboldened other Christians, and the attacks spread. Number 11. After another half-century, the state ratcheted up the penalties for worshipping the old Roman gods, instituting the death penalty, and by 431 proclaimed that any pagans who still survived were to be suppressed, though we now believe that there are none. Number 12, the increasing state privileging of Christian actions and beliefs meant that in 392, the Christian bishop of Alexandria simply had the enormous statue to Serapis, famous throughout the Roman Empire, and situated in the middle of the Library of Alexandria, destroyed. And like Muslims have often done throughout the history, a church was built on top. In the aftermath, it was said that many Alexandrians, seeing what had happened to the temple, converted to Christianity instantaneously. This was a terrifying act of aggression. Almost no event, with the exception of the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in AD 410, would resound more loudly through the centuries. And that was followed up by one of the greatest Christian crimes against philosophy, the unpunished murder of the philosopher Hypatia in 415 by more lawless monks called parabalani, likely egged on by Alexandria's bishop Cyril. As Nixey says, monks, anonymous, rootless, untraceable, were able to commit atrocities with near impunity. Number 13, mutilation of people, mutilation of statues. It was all of a piece. If you would go to room 18 of the British Museum and see the Elgin marbles on display there, you can directly observe the Christian mutilation of these statues. Hands, feet, even whole limbs have gone, almost certainly smashed off by Christians trying to incapacitate the demons within. The vast majority of the gods have been decapitated. Of course, Christians in general felt that this was nothing to be ashamed of. The first commandment could not have been clearer. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. Number 14. Given that Christians worshipped ignorance, not knowledge, it's not surprising that the aforementioned St. Anthony was venerated for refusing to learn to read and write. As this love of ignorance spread, we see that while in the 3rd century there had been 28 public libraries in Rome, by the end of the 4th century they were, as the historian Ammianus Marcellinus observed, like tombs, permanently shut. Similarly, the burning of piles of prohibited books was often encouraged, as was the sometimes torture of those found to possess them. Indeed, this hunt for pagan books created such a panic that many intellectuals started to preempt the persecutors and set light to their own books. Number 15. One of the fundamental questions this book raises is to what degree the use of state sanctions, either positive in the form of bribes, tax exemptions, and political power, or negative in the form of crimes of murder and vandalism, contributed to increasing the percentage of Christians in the empire. Nixey says that it has been estimated they made up between 7 and 10% of the empire's total population at the time of Constantine's conversion in 312. And by the end of the 4th century, estimates suggest that this figure had been reversed. Between 70 and 90% of the empire were now Christian. I think we can estimate conservatively that the majority of these conversions would never have happened. Ms. Nixey fittingly ends her work by recounting the travails of the Athenian philosopher Damascus, who having previously fled the intolerance of the Christians in Alexandria, fled Athens as well in 532, rightly judging the political and social climate too increasingly dangerous, since his own brother had been tortured by the authorities. In addition, the authorities decreed, "We forbid the teaching of any doctrine by those who labor under the insanity of paganism," meaning teaching philosophy was outlawed. This in the birthplace of Western philosophy. This, as much as any single event, heralded the coming Dark Ages of human misery, sickness, and ignorance. In conclusion, I was utterly enchanted by this book. I'd give it an A, and its author charmed me again and again by her subtle wit. One instance, for example, was the following. Open an 1875 edition of the Latin poet Martial, and many of his more explicit poems will have been translated not into English, but into Italian, evidently considered a suitable language for sexual deviance. I must confess that I would not mind in the slightest to find myself under the mistletoe with Miss Nixey. If only. I bid you a very Merry Christmas, with peace on earth and goodwill to all, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.